Hello, can you hear me, Neil?
I can, Anne, yes.
Wonderful. Well, a very good morning, and you're through now to the live. So let me introduce you first to our listeners. Now, you're a leading ornithologist, an Australian ornithologist, but came over from the UK, and you've travelled the world in pursuit and study of bird life. Is that correct?
I have, Anne. I've had a wonderful life chasing birds all over the world, from the far reaches of parts of the Great Britain, including St Kilda, through Africa and all around Australia.
Oh, that's wonderful. What's the rarest bird you've ever seen in Australia? Let's go to Australia.
Okay, I suppose the rarest bird I would have seen in Australia would have been the Laysan albatross. Now, some people would know the Laysan albatross as that big goony bird that nests on the ground, that they have the aircraft flying through in the Hawaiian Islands. Sometimes you see these pictures. And they're an amazing big albatross, and they largely occur in the Northern Hemisphere. But I found one on Norfolk Island, which is where I lived, and it was the only specimen that had ever been seen in Australia or Australian waters.
Wow.
So I suppose the Laysan albatross, a spectacular bird, would be the rarest bird I've observed.
That's amazing. That would be absolutely amazing. Now, I've got some questions for you. Around about what I'd like to say about climate change, changes, the deforestation and adverse weather patterns, and the inevitable building that's taken place in Australia, the loss of wetlands as well. What effect has this all on our bird life?
Okay, so there are a range, and there's a range of different impacts that happen to native birds. Of course, I should start on a positive note. When some developments occur and we change the landscape, sometimes we can make the landscape a better place for some birds. So if we build dams and lakes and ponds and plant lots of flowering shrubs and trees and things, we can actually make the landscape better. And many people will find that their gardens are great places for birds, and it'll be because of the things they've planted. But sadly, there are other impacts of a human population, including clearing land for houses to be built, or clearing land for agriculture, which mean that certain species find the landscape less attractive, and then they can become rare, and then they can become endangered. And so, for example, along the Hervey Bay coast, there'll be species of such as the ground parrot, which need heathlands adjacent to coasts. These areas tend to get cleared by development, and we often find and we have found that the ground parrot has become a much rarer bird. I saw ground parrots in the area around Hervey Bay when I was a young person doing bird watching back in the 1980s, and those areas that I saw them in now don't have ground parrots. So some species do suffer from the effects of human development, and other species are advantaged by it and become abundant.
Yes. Now, tell me about what type of plants. You mentioned plants, people putting plants in their gardens to attract different types of birds. What kind of plants would you recommend?
Okay, so it's really quite simple. Birds need protection more than anything else. So in our gardens, we often will plant rows of shrubs along a fence line or whatever, and small birds have very little protection. Now, they don't necessarily care too much about what the plants are to get that protection, but they need protection from the predatory birds that might otherwise hunt them down.
Yes,
so the first thing you can do is have clusters of plants of a variety of species to give birds protection. Once you've got that sort of idea in place, then it's whatever the local plants in your local area produce the best flowering over the longest period. So it might be that you go to your garden centre and say, I want flowering plants, native plants that flower in all seasons. So over the course of the year, you'll have different flowering plants that will attract insects and provide food for the nectar-eating birds. So, and the third thing I would suggest is to try and have a water source. So the three keys. One is to provide protection in clusters of shrubs. The second is to have a variety of local plants that have insects, and then some sort of water, a water bath or whatever, particularly in the dry months, which can give birds that would otherwise have to fly a long distance to find fresh water.
Oh,
so they would be my
yes.
tips in any garden anywhere in the country.
Well, I tick all the boxes then. I've got all those things in place now. Also, about wetlands as well. I know more wetlands now. Up here we've got a lot of, in Fraser Coast, on the Fraser Coast region, we have a lot of canal-type systems in place, especially places like Dundarren, Ely Waters. There's lots of waterways there, so that's particularly good. Now, if you've got a house, there's plenty of houses in Dundarren that have got these canals. What can you do to attract the water birds?
Okay, well, I suppose water birds will be feeding on the aquatic insects and aquatic plants in the water itself.
Yes.
So, there's not much you can do in terms of, creating a better food source for them in the water. But what is useful is if they can have basking places. So they'll come out of the water and they'll dry off and they'll bask when they're not in the water. So protected spots, now it mightn't be possible in an individual person's garden, but in various locations along a canal system or in a wetland, if there are protected areas where, especially if it's tidal, where at low tide there's banks come out, those areas to be protected will also advantage the water birds that are living in the area.
That's terrific. Now, another question I wanted to ask you too. Recently, going back, or probably a month or two, we've had a lot of dead birds around, suddenly everywhere, just dead birds. Obviously, do you think from exhaustion?
Well, dead birds there can be a whole range of reasons. So, for example, if it's along a beach coast,
yes, it is. Yeah.
What you have is migratory birds that, for example, mutton birds that nest in the Bass Strait Islands. They migrate up the east coast. The young birds have just come out of the burrows. They're just feeding for the first time. They're migrating all the way up to the Aleutian Islands and the Bering Sea. And sometimes what happens is we have a large number of the young birds of the year not able to make it. So they're starting their migration, they start to head up the east coast, and they die and they get washed ashore, or they're in very poor condition when they're washed ashore.
Yes.
That's one scenario that can lead to large numbers of particular species of birds ending up, for example, washed up on a beach.
These weren't mutton birds. In the past, we've had a lot of mutton birds, but these were... I couldn't identify them. They were black. They were slim birds, about the size of mutton birds, with long beaks. Okay,
so you could have die-offs of birds like cormorants and snake birds or darters.
No, they weren't either of those. I know those. No,
okay.
They were smaller than those.
Well, in that case, if they're small, these are on a beach, and
yes, along the beach, in the grasslands.
Okay, well, there's a number of other species of seabirds other than mutton birds, like petrels that nest on the island.
I wondered if they were. That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah,
if they were.
They nest along the coast, the islands of central and northern New South Wales and parts of the Queensland coast. And they're not such migratory birds, but when the young come out, they will then spread up and down the coast. And if they're in poor condition because there hasn't been, you might get effects of El Nino, where there isn't as much food in a particular year, and birds will starve, and it's desperately sad when you see it. But it's an effect of the lack of food in the ocean at the time.
Yes.
And they could well have been petrels or storm petrels. Because that also happens with them from time to time.
Oh, that's, that was very sad. And lastly, now you're going to Norfolk Island. You're taking people to Norfolk Island next year to look talk about that. I am, Anne. It's very exciting. Finally, we're able to travel about a bit, and I'm taking a group of people to Norfolk Island in September next year. My brother's an archaeologist and a prehistorian, so we're going to be looking at the old Kingston historical buildings, etc. Yes.
And I'm a bird watcher, and we're going to be looking at some of the seabirds and some of the national park features. So we're going to have a week of wonderful, fun time. People will get their own car to drive around in, accommodation, the flights paid for. And that's all being organised by the Norfolk Island Travel Service, or people can go onto my website, which is neilhermes.com.au. And yes, and I'd hop in and get tickets for that because, of course, next year things are all getting booked out pretty quickly.
So have you still got spaces?
There are some spaces left, and I'd suggest people get in and try and book before Christmas because I think that those spots will disappear quickly. In fact, they're going quite fast.
Yes, I would imagine.
In September next year to Norfolk Island for 8 days, and it's an all-inclusive escorted tour of the island with. It's going to be fabulous. We'll have one night. We'll have a dinner where we'll all get together, and I'll tell some stories about Norfolk Island, and my brother will as well, and we'll escort people around the various sites. It'll be a great trip. That's Norfolk Island Travel Service or neilhermes.com.au.
Yes, I've got that, so I can give that out later as well. And one last thing to tell you, we've had a osprey nesting down in Urangan, actually, Harvey Bay, the suburb of Urangan, right near the beach there. And it's brought out many people, camera photography enthusiasts. And
That's fantastic.
It was beautiful.
Isn't it great? Because the ospreys were a declining bird around the world a couple of decades ago. There's a famous one in Scotland that came back to England, and it became a very famous bird. People watched it. It was the first one back in the UK for decades. We've been fortunate. They've been relatively common in northern parts of Australia and down as far as Hervey Bay. But in New South Wales, Victoria, they've been very rare, but they are now spreading along the coast. Fantastic birds, amazing when they launch themselves into the ocean to catch fish. Spectacular birds, the osprey. You're very lucky.
We certainly are. Well, thank you once again for talking to us. Now, I've got your phone number, so if we have any questions on birds that comes in, I'll certainly direct our listeners over to you so they can ask you the questions.
Fantastic, Anne, and I look forward to being on the show again soon, and I can take questions on the show in the future as well.
Certainly welcome, and I'll be talking to you soon too. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne. Cheers.
Till next time. Take care.
Good afternoon to all the visitors. Cheers.
Bye.